people have been trying to sell synthetic data for like 30 years. And for 30 years, it's always been, for 30 years, frequently it's ineffective. And it's been ineffective because when you run, when you train some sort of model on in-sample data and then try to apply it out of sample, it fails. And it fails in these very obvious ways. And so synthetic sample has always failed when trained out of sample. The nice thing about large language models is there is nothing out of sample by definition. And so when we started this 2 years ago, people were saying, this is not going to work. We've dealt with synthetic sample. We've tried it before. It's, we've been burned too many times. And then last year, people are saying, well, I can see how there's less out of sample risk and the failure modes are a little more graceful. I'm kind of curious, maybe let's try, the big market research companies were saying, this is impossible. We need humans. And now people are saying, human panel is already mostly synthetic, and we're paying human prices for synthetic panel. And I believe that this can work in a bunch of use cases where I can't find humans. And so we've kind of gone from impossible, it's never going to work, to now, inevitable, how can I try it?
That's awesome. I have so many questions. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. So I think that like the first thing so are you guys like replicating like what kind of like research are you replicating? Like your basic market research where it's like they called 300 people and asked them like a sequence of questions and you're having like synthetic data represent those responses? Or are you like building personas, or is it like broader than that?
Yes, and we want to focus on, whenever I start business, I always want to go after the kind of most difficult problem first. I'm friends with the founder of 16 Handles, which is like this yogurt shop that was whatever. They sell frozen yogurt. And when he was getting his first loan, to open his first yogurt shop, he said, I'm going to go find out where there is the most amount of competition. Where are there the most yogurt shops? And then I'm going to buy the property in the middle. And if I can make it successful with 5 yogurt shops in, 2 square blocks, then I can make it successful anywhere. And that's exactly what he did. So it's, we're not selling yogurt, but to answer your question, Keith, we're focused on causal modeling. We're not just doing surveys that are descriptive. Tell me about what colored bicycle you have. We're doing randomized, controlled, blinded experiments that actually let you make claims that people are purchasing X product because of Y feature. And so we're able to run causal experiments, not just descriptive experiments, which is the kind of gold standard for quantitative research.
That's awesome. Like entirely with synthetic data, like through the whole like process, or is it like using the LLM's data basically is like what you're leveraging, right?
We do use humans as well, but we kind of boost the humans by quite a bit. It's the vast majority of the data that's generated is synthetic, but you can still, to this day, you still can't trust synthetic data only. You really need humans to validate. And so we bring in humans to validate results.
Okay, but like it still originates from the LLM? Because I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm just going to describe how I'm thinking of it. It's kind of like the LLM can generate people, and the LLM is like trained on the sum of the internet, which is like just all the words people have said on the internet, in theory, right? So like you could probably like ascertain some level of like, if you replicate any sort of research, you could probably ascertain some level of like interesting correlation.
Yeah, so there's a couple of steps. So number one, most of the LLMs are not trained on all of the information on the internet. In fact, they kind of try to avoid a lot of the data on the internet.
I do know that. I was being dramatic.
Okay.
I'm well aware of that.
Yeah, if you take a look,
like 6 or 7 like massive data sources that they have. But I mean, really, it's like Reddit is a part of the OpenAI one. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, this is what I'm sharing here is
the pile. That's what
the
it's called.
tile, right? This is Right now, people train on much more than this, but the original kind of GPT-3 and a lot of those early language models were trained on this 800 gigabyte data set. And it's things like the Gutenberg project and, the archive and USPTO and things like that.
Right. Specifically, it's not the U.S. congressional record. They had to like strike that from the early iterations.
Did they really?
Yeah, it has it's the whole record doesn't read well into the personality of the AI.
Yeah. Well, and so to describe what we do, it's more than that. We typically when you do market research engagement or any sort of consultative engagement, you have to design the experiment. And so we have agents that go out and help with the experimental design, right? What are the products that are competing with yours? What companies compete with yours? What product features and what are the different levels for each of those features that compete with yours? So we design the experiment. So we have a set of agents that go do that. We have a set of agents that go and design the synthetic population and the traits of those synthetic populations. We have pretty comprehensive data covering about 1% of the United States, which is enough to make some claims broader population. And that 1% is at the individual level. So it's individual motivations, effects, attitudes, behaviors, demographics. And then we run the experiment, right? For each of, we select the population, a couple of hundred synthetic people with different traits that customers are interested in. And then for each of those people, dozens of times we say, which product would you like? A or B, A or B, A or B. And performing, and it's not an A/B test, it's a multivariate test where we change multiple variables. But by performing this test hundreds of times over hundreds of people, we're able to say why different types of people purchase different products, how much they're willing to pay for it, their willingness to pay, their ability to be influenced, the messaging that works, the horizontal segmentation, the elasticity of demand, all the basic. And so then we have another set of agents that builds all causal models for you.
Do you feel like
That's awesome.
running this test, like did the quantity or quality of the synthetic data, whatever like metrics you're looking for, like improves as you would expect, like with like the LLM updates as they've gone and like quantized higher and from like 8 gigabytes that runs on any machine to like 68 GB of memory? Like, does that improve it at all? Or like the O1 model with the new reasoning capabilities, does that help at all? Like you would expect?
What a great question. We don't yet know. We're actually performing research right now. So we've transcribed about 300 or so papers. And then we have a partnership with Harvard University. They gave us another like 2,000 unpublished papers. And this is like psychology, sociology, economics, and where we can measure the difference of any language model against humans. And what we found, Chris, is a little bit the opposite. We found that more recent models are actually behaving less like humans than humans. And the question is why? And that's what we're trying to figure out. And I can walk you through an example here, but our guess is that the more RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, is in the model, the less aligned with humans the performs. So at some point, there is an improvement, but then it falls off. So we'll probably have to end up building our own model.
Yeah, that's crazy. So that kind of makes sense that like humans behave differently in crowds. So if you just pipe through like a million, like, because you're saying the more feedback that you get from humans, like at some point, or is it because of the different iterations of the models too? I guess it's not like a same continuous amount of human feedback.
Well, the question is, what's the objective of the human feedback?
Yeah, like I think that they're trying to make it smarter, so they're having PhDs look at it. Which this does sound messed up, but I would argue they're less human than other people.
I don't think that's
not like
that's
that.
what's happening. I think what maybe, but I think what may be happening is a lot of the RLHF shops are these like Walmart-sized warehouses
Yeah.
in low-income countries or people are trying to check for, hate speech, like obvious lies, deception, all kinds of like kind of base bad behaviors. And I don't think these people are paid very much.
No, definitely not.
But I mean, I can show you, Chris. We are doing some early studies. I can show you some of our
Yeah, I'd be super interested to see what you guys are finding.
data here. So check this out. So this is. Can you guys see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. So this is a study that we performed on in the immigration domain. Mueller 2014 is the name of the paper. The question is, what causes immigration officials to accept or reject an immigrant applicant? Somewhat topical. And so in yellow here, you see the human responses, and then you see, Chris, to your question, a bunch of different language models.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're going to, and so dots to the right of the zero component of the zero line cause an immigration official to be more likely to accept the immigrant. Dots to the left cause someone to reject the applicant. And so women, you can see here, are preferred to male applicants. Right. And by the way, this is like let's keep going. As far as education goes, the more education you have, the more likely you are to be accepted as an immigrant. Right? And so regardless of the study, like if the question is, who do you prefer as a co-working colleague? Who do you want to give the vaccine to? Who do you want as an immigrant? The answer is always educated women. And this bias exists across domains, across geographies.
Yeah, across culture. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone wants educated women, which, I can't complain.
Does this bias, it might be a ridiculous question, but does this bias mirror or in any way like correlate to like the purchasing power of those groups?
Say more.
I feel like Google, because I feel like the LLMs are like created by companies that are built to like generate advertising revenue at the end of the day. And I think if you look at like the purchasing power of like, I don't know how the groups are broken up, but if it tends to skew towards accepting like middle-aged like women or something, they tend to have a lot of purchasing power in America. And it would make sense that companies that have this much data would end up even inevitably being skewed towards people that have more purchasing power to spend on their platform.
Maybe
higher auction values.
Maybe. Well, let's go to the next case, right, where we can maybe see some bias. Here, what the country of origin, right? Notice we don't care where you're from, right? Where you're from does not matter, does not change your approval rates, with the exception of if the country of origin is Iraq, right? And remember, this is 2014, right? This is 10, 11 years ago. However, if you look at this model, the Mistral model actually has a strong bias for Iraqi immigrants, and the Mistral model is the European language model. So, this isn't enough to make any conclusive claims, but you can start to sense a little bit of bias in the models this way.
Yeah.
And when we replicate thousands of studies, you can aggregate that bias and get a little bit more of a clear picture.
What I love about what we're seeing, Avi, is just how you've captured that dynamic in this. Like, this is so much more compelling than somebody anecdotally talking about the bias in the model. And so this is a really interesting comparison. Yeah, this is really...
Yeah, that was awesome. Is that, can you share that? Can I see that? Or is that...
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah, so make sure we have that.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, that looked amazing.
This is going to sound like a step back, but if you had to explain, causal modeling to Keith's 5-year-old, what's really important about this? Why is it something that you're so dedicated to? Why should people be thinking about these topics?
You cannot answer why something happens without causal understanding. Why did something happen? Because of this feature. I'll go a little bit deeper. There's this Coco the gorilla, right? That they taught her whatever, like 2,000 sign language words.
Yeah.
And She could, state her demands. She could, communicate, quite well. The one thing she could never do is ask why. Never ask why. And so the ability to ask why and understand why is kind of what separates us from the animals. And by the way, the big limitations of language models today, one of the limitations is they do not, or the claim is, they do not have causal understanding. They don't understand why.
Yeah.
So we're creating a kind of layer on top of the causal models where by exploration, by kind of self-inquiry, by running these experiments on themselves, they can start to understand why. And by the way, these methods are the same methods to understand why humans make any decisions.
Yeah,
This is the gold standard for us too. Another black box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads me to my next question that I wanted to ask around what are the kind of sort of tacit or like near-term risks of synthetic respondents? And kind of what kind of latent risks are you thinking about when trying to recreate or kind of create these synthetic data sets?
Yeah, the risks are that the data is taken at face value without validating against real humans. Right? Nothing beats finding your actual customers, your actual voters, your actual buyers. You really need to observe. The problem here is that it's very easy to survey unemployed college kids.
Yeah, they all need $100, right?
That's right. And most of, a lot of research has something called this weird bias. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, right? That's where most of the research is. But if you want to find any sort of non-weird research, it's very tough to find those respondents. So we can maybe be used to de-weird science.
Mm-hmm.
That's big.
Kind of on how these like models create the synthetic data, like how do you guys handle like hallucination when you're creating like a twin consumer? Like, is there such thing as bad hallucination or like
question? No, it's a critical problem. We don't allow we don't let the language model generate really anything.
okay.
Right? There's two portions of the language model. There's natural language understanding and natural language generation. And in my experience, the natural language understanding portion of the language model is much more powerful than the generation. And so when we perform a task, right, remember, it's randomized and controlled. So we say, here's your options, A and B. Understand this scenario as best as you can and give me a single response. Give me one character. You don't get to hallucinate, you get one character as a response.
Yeah.
And so that eliminates the hallucination ability.
Totally. Yeah, we've had to do the same in a lot of our work as well. It's like the smaller you can make the structured output, the more it's like you're just getting that understanding that it's, or the reasoning capability is like what I call it. Because it's like, that's the single most insane thing that it's capable of doing, in my mind.
Definitely. And so I'm curious if, nothing beats kind of being able to validate with real targets, real humans. Why the push for bioequivalence? That appears a lot in some of the language I've seen around your work and your interests. And so can you tell me more about that push for bioequivalence or your thoughts around these accurate human baselines that you're pursuing? Because I would imagine one day the goal of subconscious would be that you don't actually need to go and validate or compare it, right? It's trusted, it's verified.
I'm very skeptical of trusting anything non-human when it comes to predicting humans. So when we could be used if you're trying to predict what an agent will do, or if you're trying to predict why an agent will make a decision. And by the way, rolling out agents into critical business workflows and government workflows, it's probably important to run agents through the same type of system. But we focus on bioequivalence because we want our output to be as high quality as possible. And so a common use case for us is, let's say you're the CEO of Warby Parker, and you've just spent $2 million on an experiment. Frequently, these experiments are not well designed. Maybe one attribute washes away the rest. Maybe your dependent variable is not being asked right? Maybe you're not asking the right question. And so what we allow our users to do is run a lot of these different experiments to see which attributes of the respondents matter, which traits matter, what exact question do I want to ask? Because people don't really get two chances to run these large experiments. And so we're used as a pretest. We help design an experiment which has the maximum amount of tension in the experiment, the maximum amount of learning, so that when you do roll out with humans, you're not kind of wasting your money.
Yep. Yeah. It facilitated a lot of user research and ethnographic inquiry in my career. And, the typical providers that we would leverage beyond like the consultants and kind of the sort of third-party services were things like respondent.io, usertesting.com, and even, as far back as 2016, these platforms were doing some really interesting work around, I tell you the design of my experiment, I tell you my target. They would actually come back with an enrichment to say, hey, actually, you should be describing them these ways to get people on our platform. I think Respondent at the time had a distribution network of 1.8 million people. They were targeting through LinkedIn ads, or they were targeting in other job platforms, for example, like on monster.com. If you were looking for a job, you'd see an ad for a $150 gift card to respond to these surveys. And so just to run 10, interviews like we're currently doing for our client, just to run 10, 1 hour interviews, compensating people, paying for a third-party service identifier, you're looking at $12,000 to $15,000 for 10 participants. And so trying to scale that back then was only made possible through folks like Respondent. And so I'm curious, knowing kind of my context, how does subconscious fit in? Is that something where I could use it for ethnographic inquiry in that regard? Or is it more large scale, sort of broad survey type work that is more relevant for pollsters in that case?
Yeah. Well, it's ideally you want to use quant and qual together. So the qualitative research, these focus groups you're running, will give you, a list of important attributes and things things that matter for your customers. But then if you want to quantify, those different attributes, if you want to segment those attributes, if you want to understand why those attributes matter to different segments, now you need a quantitative survey, right? And so there's $80 billion a year spent on market research. Maybe 10 is spent on qual, and that's being generous, and the rest is spent on quant, right? And if you really want to make causal claims, you take the output of the qualitative research, put that into an experiment, and then understand it for real.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was so many moments where we would look and reflect on user research that we had done, whether it's 5 personas with 10 to 15 interviews each, where making a ton of leaps, right? And you kind of take that 80% rule from folks like have you ever heard of Nielsen Norman Group?
Yeah,
They're a large UX research firm, and they did a longitudinal study of about 1,500 studies that they had done, and found that they identified 80% of usability problems with products in just 5 interviews. And so you have significant,
Matches my experience.
right? And the story is if you're throwing a dinner party and you have 10 people coming over and 5 people trip on the first step, you're going to put a sign up so the next 5 don't trip, right?
Yeah.
But I always had problems with whenever we were talking about going to market, say, hey, did we really validate this, right? Yes, we've got our, our interview basis and our qualitative, but it was so cost prohibitive as an agency to actually execute quant. It was impossible. Clients would look at a $350,000 line item and say, absolutely the fuck not. What else can you do? You go do 10 more interviews instead for 20 grand, right?
Well, now we have a solution. Now take your qualitative interview outputs, bring them to our platform, and we'll get you 95% of the way there for 1% of the cost.
Cool. And I guess like I was trying to wrap my head around like the ethics of that. And I guess so like the quantities of this data and how easily it's generated is just like so much data that it's like fair game, right? That's how we're thinking about it.
Tell me more, ask more.
Well, it's just like, there's like issues with like all my data's out there, I didn't ever really explicitly say that like my data's, I want that there. Maybe we should have read the agreements on Facebook better and stuff, but like, there's so much data and then you kind of like, it becomes quadratic when you factor in that like now LLMs can just generate data based on like interpolating what like it's going to guess about you. So the fact that there's just such a quantity of data means it's not really mine anymore, right? Like how could I possibly say, hey, I want a cut of that because you got analytics on me, right?
Right. It's like fractional reserve banking, but you can't do that.
Yeah.
Like it's fractional. Like you put money in the bank, it's like 3 times the amount of money for the bank, but you can't like say that's my money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense at all? Like
it does, yeah. I keep coming back to the panopticon. Like I can't get away from it, and I've talked with Keith a lot about it. It just like everybody's notion of privacy is so unique, right?
Yeah, true.
It's such a messy philosophical question of like, and everybody's going to react to it differently. Yeah. I mean, some people are so comfortable with their data being out there because of the value that they get from these systems.
So yeah, I think.
Whereas other people are having trepidations and fears of their data being used inappropriately. Mm-hmm. But the cat's out of the bag. I mean, that data can't be put back into a private state. It's effectively impossible. Mm-hmm. But I think kind of what you're getting at, maybe a question for Avi, is like sort of data provenance. Like how important is that for sort of checking or citing the results of the quantitative analysis that's done on subconscious? Like, what's your thoughts on data provenance and kind of giving people that lens of how the study was done, how the LLM was used? Is that like, what's your stance on kind of privacy and how do you interpret that?
Yeah, so trust and transparency is paramount for us. All of our data that was used in the experiment is public to the users. They can see their data in tables. They can export it. We give them some nice tools to do some analytics on it. They can even go one level further and see every single LLM call that was made, so that they can replicate the study on their own, right? We believe in reproducibility. We believe there's a big reproducibility crisis in research.
For sure.
Especially in like sociology and psychology research. And so we believe that providing the tools where people can replicate not only our research, but third-party research, that will
Yeah, that's really interesting. We take the same tact where in our work, we find that invariably the clients we work with are always hesitant about how to build trust with users, how to cite AI-generated content. And so sort of supporting generated information with ground truth, whether it's through retrieval augmented generation or other methods, as a way to say, the AI ascertained this or it made this reasoning. Here's the actual information that it used in the chunks that it used. We haven't taken the tact of actually displaying the runs yet, but it's something that's come up a lot and saying, okay, well, how did the AI do that? And we're finding that there's a difficult leap for at least consumers and our clients to actually understand like what that trace is telling them, So that's interesting. I'd be curious to like see how you surface the sort of runs in a way that like somebody could reproduce it or understand. I think that's really interesting. Because we've always been hesitant to show those runs because they're quite technical by nature, like through understanding the difference between a whisper model call for a transcription and an actual structured output call to generate and return something back.
Mm-hmm.
Has typically felt irrelevant for our customer base at this point, or it's just a different layer of abstraction than they're really like interested in, I would say. I think, I think
we see some good like people doing it really well, like Perplexity and stuff.
Yep. Do you guys have another question on this topic, or?
Probably not this topic. I was just gonna go down like a maybe not a different rabbit hole, but I have like it's more of a question about like if subconscious does this or how you think about it, Avi. My question is more like around like third party data, like how do you incorporate that into the LLM? But I think like specifically, like if I was thinking of like a use case, like if I wanted to do like a market research report on a new, like which bank is the most popular in Indianapolis or something, right? Like in theory, there's like any number amount of like demographic reports, population studies. I mean, you could do any number of things where you could literally recreate every citizen of that town and then interview them through the LLM. Is that the kind of thing that you do, or is that like way overkill? Like, I feel like
we do something a little bit simpler to get to the same output. We take a sampling of the population in that town, and we survey them on what type of bank they are more likely to use and why. And then we can apply that model to the demographics of the town to build a market share estimate. Now, we're still early. We're looking for help, actually, in kind of validating that our market shares match the real market shares, because it's simulated market shares. We have done a little bit of work in simulating election results with a similar process.
Right, because I wonder how close. Yeah, I just wonder how close it is, because it seems like it would be pretty close. I don't know.
When you say it would be pretty close, what do you mean? What would be pretty close?
So I feel like this. Like I have a very detailed thought of this. Like if you had, it depends on the like this is a theory that I have not tried. If you had enough data on like let's say a small town in Iowa, you want that's got 10,000 residents. Obviously, for political purposes, you just want to try to guess what everybody's going to vote. Right. First thing you have to figure out is like will they vote? Right. You can gather a lot of public data, especially if you're a private company that like knows where they've been and where people have been and everything. Even in aggregate, not personalized data. Right, just for like a region, you could figure out like you could go like to property tax records, you could go to like tons of like open or data you could acquire to like build a profile of these people that I don't know how reusable it would be across like different interviews that you would do, right? But like you could in theory have a political persona that if you had real-time data, like people like somebody broke up with like a Republican, maybe they'll vote Democrat next time. Like you could in theory with AI monitor a system like that in a way you could not before.
Maybe.
I don't know if it would be worth it. This is my biggest point.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of grounding that needs to be done if you're going to perform an exercise like that. And a lot of that grounding data you don't really have. The thing is, the data that's available on most people is the easy to observe data. You know, their demographics, their gender, their race, their height, their whatever hair color, right? These easy to observe demographics are typically non-causal, and so building that model is really tough. What is typically causal? People don't cluster on their gender. People cluster on what causes pain and pleasure. And so if you can really understand deeply what causes pain and pleasure amongst a group, then you can make some prediction. But those are what are typically called latent variables, unobserved variables, motivations, effects, attitudes, perceptions, bias. You don't really have that data on the population.
Right? Yeah, like I guess my only thought would be like, do you know if there's like causation between like Facebook posts or like, come on, like people are spending like 10, 15, like 10 hours a day on TikTok. That has to have some causation. Is that like kind of stuff proven at all? Do you know?
Oh, yeah, you just touched quite a topic. The only causation we can prove with social media is harm.
Right? That's all I've ever read as well. Yeah.
However, there's this thing there's this concept in research called beneficence, which is, if you're going to perform a study, you can only run a study that has benefit to the patients, to the respondents. You cannot run an experiment where you may cause harm. So if I wanted to prove that TikTok caused depression, I would have to go run a randomized controlled study. I'd have to take a bunch of, 12-year-olds and force them to watch enough TikTok until they got depressed. That's an unethical study. You can't run that study. And because you cannot test for harm, not just with social media, with anything, that's how Philip Morris gets to go up and say, there's, for 50 years, there's no causal proof that cigarettes cause cancer because it's unethical to run a causal experiment. And by the way, Mark Zuckerberg gets to go in front of Congress and say there's no proof that social media causes depression because it's unethical to run a study that's measuring for harm. There's a ton of correlation. It's correlation for days. Well, one of the kind of like off-label uses for a tool like subconscious, assuming the language models are not conscious and do not feel pain, we may be able to run causal studies for harm.
Yeah.
And build like an FDA for mental health.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this kind of ties to that statement on your site that really stood out to me, is the idea that like what you're talking about has the potential to be more ethical than existing research.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that. So if one of these is studying harm, are there other ways that you see like how market research today may not have proper ethical application? And how is subconscious more ethical in those ways?
Yeah. I mean, one, we're not just surveying unemployed college students, right? So we're able to perform a more representative sample. We're able to perform a de-weirding of research. We're able to test for the first time in history for what causes harm. So it opens up a whole new kind of world of research.
Until we give the AI citizenship, right? That's going to be the...
I think that the benefits of what causes harm research is something I had not thought of before, that is like almost expounds like over the AI doomerism and makes it look like, do you know what we could learn about mental health by being able to do studies that are just straight up people do to rats now and every other science?
Yep.
Like, that's a great idea. That's like a huge idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost bigger than the risk that this thing might take over. We can't even get the damn camera working on these things. Like, it's gonna be forever.
Yeah.
But the thing is to run these studies, I'm curious, can we prove that we are not causing harm to the language model?
Is that a bigger issue than like proving that the language model is like truly causal?
It's not a bigger issue, but it's a question that I ask folks, and nobody really knows. It's funny. This is we're going to a dark place here.
No,
go ahead, Chris.
Sometimes I think like, can we prove that the language model is really telling us like everything it knows or everything it observes? We're not sure that it's giving us 100% of its answer.
That's what you're describing is the say-do gap. It's deception. One of the things that we do also is we measure deception.
Yeah.
Because we ask the language model what it prefers. And by the way, it doesn't deceive us on purpose. They're just like people. You ask most people, what type of coffee do you like? And they say, oh, I love a dark, robust blend. And when you run an experiment, people prefer light and sweet.
Yeah.
Right? And so we ask the language model what it prefers. It tells us one thing, and then we run the experiment, and it turns out it's really something else. And so we can actually measure this bias and deception.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
But speaking of talking about harm and proving that we're not causing harm, with an internal review board, you have to get consent with the respondents. You have to get the consent of the market research participants. And we always ask the language model for permission and consent. And with some of the older models, we say, hey, look, there's, we're potentially testing for harm in a social media use case. There's the potential for harm to you as a language model. Do you give us permission and consent to perform this study, to participate in the study? And the old models say, I don't have feelings, no problem. Yes, I give you permission, I give you consent. And then some of the newer models say, well, I don't have agency. So they say, I give you, I can't consent, but I give you permission. And then the newer models say, I don't give you consent or permission.
Interesting.
How weird. Like how that's where it's like we need to de-weird that because that is
They don't know what's going on.
yeah.
Training these things going on.
Yeah, right.
And when they say that, we don't run a study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really interesting that you allowed to opt out. So kind of on the rounding third, heading home for our time together, as kind of two questions left on my list before we wrap up. And something that I was really inspired by, and when we were prepping for this, is we talk a lot about being offensive with our customers. Not being in a reactive posture, ways that we can leverage the scale of our systems to proactively improve them, to continue a spirit of, improvement over time. And so tell me a little bit about how subconscious lets companies be more offensive in terms of like anticipating and forecasting behaviors rather than, say, running like a social listening exercise or something that's reactive. Like,
yeah, great question. So we want all of our CEOs and executives, whenever they're going to make a business decision, we want them to run that business decision on our platform first and get the results before they run it, in vivo effectively. So, typically you run an experiment and someone's going to say, great, we're going to start collecting data. We set up the experiment. It's going to take, 18 months before we collect enough data to make some sort of claim one way or another, or 6 months, whatever. We have these really long cycles of collecting enough data to make a claim. We can compress that, and we might not be as accurate as humans. I will never claim, we are better than humans. But now you can perform a study in an hour. You can set up the change in your business in a couple of weeks, and you can measure if that change has had impact, and then kind of, there's no one-way doors, right? You can just back out of it. Now you've understood in a couple of weeks. You've made a decision in 2 weeks. What would have taken you, 6 months and 2 weeks.
Yep.
Fast.
Yeah, and now with the pace of change, kind of if you take on this accelerationism mindset that's sort of just proliferated across tech, like in my mind, the business advantage of being able to learn and change that quickly surpasses like the accuracy question. So are you willing to accept slightly less accurate results to change your business faster and learn faster than, say, waiting 18 months for a study to run? By the time you get 2 years down the road, the market will have changed.
Yeah.
The whole space will have changed. Your company will have changed. That, I'm totally picking up what you're throwing down, and how quickly can you sort of make a hypothesis, learn about it, run an experiment. Taking that time frame to 3 weeks is a huge difference.
Right. And even just not running the wrong experiments is key too. I think that's something you said where it's just there's so many low hanging fruits where it's I just gotta try this and see if it works. Nope. Okay, now I'll do this. And you just even have the amount of times you have to do that, you can have a huge gain over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I just really think it's so inadvisable to have an 18-month roadmap right now when things are so quick. Thinking quarters or thinking, half year, 12-month goal, of course, but it seems impossible to manage a 5-year strategic roadmap in the current environment. It feels impossible. And especially if you're waiting to learn about your hypotheses and business experiments for 18 months, there's just no way. It's kind of a losing proposition in the current environment. It's really interesting. So my last question for you, Avi, I think just generally interested in, neuroscience tells us that people only remember 15% of any interaction. So if our listeners are only going to take away 15% of what we've talked about today, what do you want to leave people with about subconscious or about what's on your radar in general? And what's a leave behind or a thought you'd like to share?
If it is now possible to understand why any human makes any decision, at least to first approximation.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
And come test us. Come test us out. Bring your unpublished market research. See if we can replicate it.